This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner. This is podcast episode 237, and I am sitting with Ben Smith, head brewer for Surly, upstairs at the production brewery. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
We are recovering from quite a party last night here at the Craft Brewers Conference. It was something.
It's been a really great week, and last night really felt kind of like the climax. We still have a couple days left of the Craft Brewers Conference today and a little bit tomorrow, but it's just been such a wonderful week having everybody here in Minneapolis for the first time for the Craft Brewers Conference, and seeing so many friends. I mean, COVID was a long winter, and I feel like we're finally coming out of that, and it just is awesome.
For sure. Last night we were at First Avenue, the legendary rock club, and Trampled by Turtles headlined the show. Surly and BSG were the lead sponsors, and we were a small second sponsor on that thing. Hopped in.
Thank you for that.
Hey, no, it was a lot of fun. We had a fantastic time.
Yes, I'm a little slow today, so bear with me. I'm still recovering a little bit, but
sure.
it was awesome. It was so much fun.
Yeah.
And thanks to BSG for sponsoring with us as well.
Yeah, it was absolutely fun. We're going to talk on this episode about IPA in general. We're going to talk about unlocking thiols and getting modern flavors out of hazy IPAs and juicy IPAs. We're going to talk about recontextualizing West Coast IPA. You guys have just launched a new brand of a not hazy West Coast style IPA, but also obviously as we were thinking about beers in that kind of realm now, we're always looking at them through a new lens of flavor, something that's reflected through the flavor lens of where hops and where IPA is. Now, we're going to talk about how you guys do that. Before we do that, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D also stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by BSG and RAR Malting Company, who also, again, sponsored the show last night with us. The home of fossil-free malt, RAR's headquarters in Shakopee, Minnesota, is powered by renewable electricity. Malt houses and kilns are fed by an electrostatic boiler fueled on agricultural byproducts, much of which is waste from the malting process. By eliminating the use of natural gas, RAR Malting Company reduces CO2 emissions by 260,000 tons per year, while filling 25% of the U.S. brewing industry's malt needs. Put the power of RAR malt in your beer at go.bsgcraft.com/contact us. Before we get started, I want to remind you, if you are launching a brewery or you're brewing planning, go to breweryworkshop.com. We've got a few spots left for our Brewery Accelerator event up in Portland, Oregon. Always a fantastic time, and BSG also supports us on that event. So lots of good stuff here. We do a festival here in Minnesota. I was just here in Minneapolis about 4 weeks ago. I feel like I've been in Minneapolis maybe more than I've been home over the last 4 weeks, which is a little bit crazy. Spent a week in Chicago between those things. Anyway, fantastic beer city. Love what you guys are doing. Ben, give us the background on you and your arc through brewing.
So I started as a home brewer out of college. I was actually working in marketing and sales for a theater here in town, so nothing to do with brewing. And in college, I kind of started in science. I had a couple of years. I got through organic chemistry and said, this is not my thing, and moved over more to the liberal arts side of things. And so in my 20s, I was doing that and started homebrewing. An ex bought me a homebrew kit, and I kind of got obsessed. I'm a little OCD at times, so I went down the rabbit hole. I started getting all the books, doing all the science, brewing multiple times a week, just basically giving beer out because there's no way you could drink that much beer. At least I hope not. And just fell in love with it. And that was kind of before the real craft beer boom, at least here in Minneapolis. So there was only a few breweries around, but At one point, I just kind of wondered, I wonder if I can get paid to do this.
Sure.
Which I'm sure a lot of people ask themselves that. But it was a good time to ask that question. And I had spent some time down at Town Hall here in Minneapolis, which is a brew pub. And Mike Hoops is the brewer down there. He's a really nice guy. So even as a home brewer, he would answer a lot of questions. And I started asking him about the industry and what to do. And he was like, well, don't work for free, which was great advice because at that time, I think people were kind of being taken advantage of a little bit.
Sure.
And I also went to this new small little brewery in Brooklyn Center called Surly Brewing Company. And I was on a tour, and the owner, Omar Ansari, who's now my boss, I asked him kind of some other questions. He said, marry someone with health insurance. I was like, also good advice.
Fantastic advice. Yeah.
Thanks, Omar. So I just started kind of looking around to see if there's a job, and I didn't really find anything here. Eventually, I found an opportunity out in Big Sky, Montana, a little tiny brew pub up there. There was a Minneapolis guy actually working out there at the time. His name's Spencer Anderson, who later would work for Surly and now is down the road at another brewery. So I'd gotten in touch with him and the boss there and kind of flew out there and checked it out. So basically, I left a pretty decent job, full benefits here in town, and moved out to Montana to work for $10 an hour and no benefits in my late 20s. But it was awesome. There's two of us that did just about everything. So I started washing kegs. I did that for months and months and months and cleaning tanks and just doing basically all the grunt work.
Right.
But that's good because that's a big part of brewing is just cleaning and keeping up with maintenance and all that stuff. And it's a good place to start. I think a lot of people, if you work in a kitchen, you start as a dishwasher. I think that's pretty comparable. And then work my way up to more cellar work, transferring beer, dry hopping, all that, and eventually up to the brew house. And it was like a small 10-barrel system, but kind of having the ability to really just jump in and figure that out at a very small scale and just kind of labor through that for a few years.
Sure.
Gave me a good perspective, and I still loved it. And I think that's key because I was working my ass off for no money, basically living in poverty. And my partner at the time had moved out with me. We didn't know anyone, and we were both just like working. And I was still homebrewing on the weekends there. In Montana. We lived in Bozeman. It was awesome, especially in the summertime. We did a ton of hiking. It was great. So around the same time, though, that I moved out there, I applied for UC Davis to be a part of their Master Brewers program. And thankfully, I had that little bit of science at the front end of my college education. So I had all the prereqs. I had a good kind of sense for that side of things. And I just had never found anything to use it practically, and brewing's perfect for that. So it worked out well. And I got into that. There was about a 3-year waiting list. So I just worked until I got the call, and finally I did. And then I left Bozeman and went down to Davis and went through that program. And that was really just an amazing time. So the UC Davis Master Brewers program, it's not a full degree. It's like a certificate course, but it's 6 months, but you're in there like 8 a.m. to 5 every day.
Yeah.
And it's not really practical. It's all like theoretical. So you're in the classroom doing science, learning everything, doing all the calculations behind every facet of brewing from malt all the way up to packaging. So and all the engineering in between. And I got to the luxury of learning from Michael Lewis, Charlie Bamforth. I mean,
yeah, some legends,
absolute legends, and in the class too. Like it's great. I'm still in touch with a lot of people I was in that program with that are in comparable positions around the country and some small and some large breweries, and it's a great network of people that I reach out to all the time.
That's the unsaid thing about these educational opportunities is that who you meet and who you start moving along with on similar career tracks can be just as valuable as the actual in-class education.
Absolutely.
I think it's the same for college everywhere too.
It's cool because if we're going to do a project, I can be like, oh, my friend Tyler over here has done this before. I can reach out and we can talk shop, or we can just hang out and have beers when they're in town for things like the Craft Brewers Conference. I saw my friend Nate last night from Epic Brewing in San Diego. It was awesome just to hang out with those guys again.
Sure.
So while I was doing all that, I mentioned a guy named Spencer Anderson had been at that same small brewery in Montana. He actually moved back to Minnesota and was working at Surly Brewing. And, I was just this guy working at a small brewery, going to UC Davis a little bit, but I used to just bug the hell out of him. And ask him questions and be like, hey, you're at Sterling, you're a big guy now. Like, and always I was like, if there's any opportunities, let me know. I'd love to get back to the Midwest. I'm from here. I grew up just a couple hours west of Minneapolis and lived in Minneapolis most of my adult life. So the goal is always to get back here. And at one point, he put me in touch with Todd Haug, my predecessor here, and we ended up chatting on the phone. And Todd offered me a job, and that was before I'd gone to UC Davis. I was still a few months out from going down there, and actually turned him down. I said, I really want this opportunity to go to Davis, because I don't think once I move into a position or a brewery like Surly, I'll have time to do that. And which is funny. He called me back like a week later. He's like, well, what if you go to Davis and then come work for Surly? So I got to thank Todd and Omar for giving me that opportunity.
Holding the spot for you.
And it was great. So I also didn't have pressure. I could be at school, knew I had a job when I got out of it, because I also wasn't working while I was there. So I had to take out a pretty big loan just to cover expenses while I was in school, which is, that's what most people have to do. But having the knowledge that I didn't have to look for a job at the same time was pretty critical to my success at that program. So
taking on student loan debt to get a brewer's job is also kind of a dicey proposition.
Absolutely. But again, Surly even then was a well-known name, a great reputation.
Sure.
They got named number one brewery by Beer Advocate around that time. And so came back here, and Surly just had a Brooklyn Center plant only. They had 20-some employees when I came back. So I got a job just shift brewing at Brooklyn Center. And that was around the same time that they were planning the facility that we're in now, our destination brewery. If you have not been here, I highly recommend coming down. We've got a massive complex with 2 separate restaurant concepts, an event space, a beer hall, and we have Festival Field in the back with bands like Ween, The National, playing. 6,500 people come down here. First Ave books all that. Was the place we were at last night.
It is a beautiful, beautiful location.
Yeah.
And it's hard to think of another beer hall that is quite as impressive as this one.
It's amazing. So I came on while they're still kind of conceptualizing this, and the goal is always to get over here and get my hands on the Rolex equipment that we're putting in. So got to come over once we did build it and help Todd and Spencer, who is still here, kind of put everything together, figure out how it works, start running SOPs, and work really, really hard, but for a lot of reward. And it's like getting handed the keys to like a brand new Ferrari and just letting us go.
Sure.
Which was great. So we learned to brew on that. It's a 100-barrel system here. We've got a little 30-barrel Sprinkman at the Brooklyn Center plant. And once we got up and running, it's just been kind of crazy ever since. So we saw pretty massive growth. And then, with COVID the last 3 years, obviously we've slowed down a little bit, but we're hoping to rev that engine back up as we come out of COVID. And so it's been wonderful. So when Todd left, I was able to kind of step up into my role now as head brewer, and I manage both breweries from a wort production side, recipe development, all of our raw ingredient procurement, hop contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a while since I've actually brewed anything.
Sure.
So I'm really thankful to my brewing team. I got to give them a shout out. So Josh runs the team over at Brooklyn Center, and Dave here at MSP, and just phenomenal teams. And it goes across production, our packaging teams, our lab, our warehouse. Those guys all are rock stars.
Awesome. We're going to talk about, again, a new project you were working on with Other Half and Phantasm. And we're talking about some of the creative ways you're pulling out some flavors there. And we're also, again, going to talk about, West Coast IPA, because Furious, is a core IPA brand for you with that kind of, bitter West Coast approach. But you've been playing in that field and doing some creative work to create alternatives also in that field. We're going to talk more about that, but first, supply chain challenges are here to stay for a while, so why not trust the experts to handle freight for your ingredients? Old Orchard has partnered with a leading logistics firm in the craft beverage industry to transport your craft concentrate blends. When you order 2 pails or more of concentrate from Old Orchard, you qualify for freight quotes from various carriers and can stay up to date on the status of your shipment. To get started on a freight quote for craft concentrates today, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, as craft beer's most trusted point of sale system arrived is the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction. With a full suite of craft-specific features, no contracts, and no monthly fees, Arrived provides the necessary tools to help your brewery grow. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. Remember, there is no I in Arrived. So Ben, let's talk about some of the stuff that you've been working on lately. Obviously this new release with Other Half and Phantasm, is something that you guys have been playing around with, and you're exploring new flavors in IPA.
Absolutely. I'm a big guy on innovation and trying new things. To the point where I move too fast for our quality department at times. It's like, let's change this, let's change that, let's just try it. So we're kind of always looking for the next cool thing, and obviously Other Half is a wonderful brewery. So we've been talking about doing a collab for a while, and we actually went out to DC and brewed a cross between their pastry base and our darkness called Pastryness. They released that in February, I believe.
Yeah.
So while we were out there, we started talking about bringing them to Minneapolis, and timing worked great to have it launched during the Craft Brewers Conference. And just thinking about what we could do. And, at the same time, we'd been talking to Laura and Lance at Omega about their thiolized yeast that they're doing using CRISPR technology, which is pretty amazing. So kind of all
listeners of the podcast will get to hear Laura about that on next week's episode. So stay tuned for that. Sure.
Yeah. So she'll drop a lot more actual science knowledge on everyone, which will be great. So it'll be a perfect follow-up.
We actually have a full class, a video class that she's done for our online education program that filmed a few weeks ago in Chicago that'll be out there for all of those all-access subscribers to Craft Beer and Brewing. So yes, definitely keep an eye out for that.
That's cool. And they're doing such amazing work there, and we're just kind of starting to dip our toes into some of the stuff that they're working on, but they've been a great resource and a great launching pad as we kind of just throw ideas out there. So it's kind of serendipitous that we're having these conversations around the same time. So we use their Bonanza yeast for the Other Half beer. So and again, that was a big kind of, what do we call it, a Russian pastry stout, which is kind of silly, but that beer turned out great, and we figured we'd do more of a hop forward IPA.
Can we call it Eastern European now? I mean, just for branding purposes. Yeah,
absolutely. So we figured we'd try another yeast, and we were going to use their Cosmic Punch, and Lance actually reached out and said, hey, we've actually got this new R&D yeast. It's like Cosmic Punch on steroids. So internally, we've been calling it Nuclear Punch. I don't know if they've actually branded it yet, but that's a great name. If you guys want it, you can have it. So Nuclear Punch is kind of like just the term we've been throwing around, and I think you said it had like 10 times the power to kind of unlock some of these bound thiols that are in the beer already. And also around the same time, I started looking at the Phantasm, and it's interesting because I didn't realize that was Joss, and I've known Joss from Garage Project from previous conferences. We did some work with the beer campus here in Nevada at the same time. Garage Project was doing that too. So again, kind of full circle, all these things kind of came together at the same time. So basically, it's everything but the kitchen sink in this beer. We just kind of threw a bunch of stuff together. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around, thiols and, what we can accomplish with some of these tools that we have. And, the goal eventually is to figure out really how to manipulate some of those flavors. It's kind of like when you first really start doing really hoppy beers, like for me, it was as a home brewer, but trying to figure out like how to actually manipulate that in a way that achieves what you kind of set out to achieve.
Sure.
And so I think
talk to me about the process of like plotting this out. What did you guys hope to achieve? Because you have to have some sort of, from a creative perspective, you have to have some goal that you're shooting for, but at the same time, you're also trying to figure out how these things work as you go in order to achieve that. And so there's some element of surprise and learning that goes along with that. So from a creative, development standpoint, how did you start thinking about, what parameters you wanted to explore and play with versus, how you're going to make a beer that people also would want to drink?
Absolutely. I think just in general, like from like my personal approach to brewing beer and creating beer is like, I want something that's unique, but also drinkable.
Yeah.
So number one, that's my first step. Like I don't want to make a beer that no one's going to want to drink. My main metric for evaluating beer is asking someone if they'd have another one. If they say no, we're probably on the wrong track. So number one, it's got to be drinkable. And it seems super simple, but there's a lot of beers out there that'll have someone be like, that's really cool, but I don't want to drink that ever again.
Sure.
And then
it's a smart commercial strategy because when people want to drink more than one, it's probably good for business
exactly.
too.
And the other side of that, the kind of the holy trinity for me of brewing is also the quality, consistency, and stability. And since we were packaging this beer, all those things were kind of taken into consideration too. It's like, A, can we repeat this? And B, is it going to be stable on the shelf in a can for a while? It's got our name on it, and it's got Other Half's name on it. So that's an important thing to consider. But from a flavor perspective, this was just kind of, at the time we were on some calls with Sam at Other Half, had our team on there. Bill Manley, our VP of brand development, works really closely with me on working on these beers. And really just kind of bringing in, want to do something with Omega again. We got put in touch with Joss. We have the Phantasm available. We never used that. Other Half had, so we were just kind of spitballing on their experience using it. And Sam had a lot of great advice because they've already obviously played around with it a little bit. And we just kind of went from there. We took a lot of people's advice. We talked to Laura and Lance in terms of figuring out the malt bill, hopping rates, which hops to use. And we settled on using some Motueka in the mash, in the Whirlpool, and in the dry hop. We also talked to another supplier, Hop Center, with the Calypso, which has got a lot of thiol potential. And we also then added the Phantasm in the mash too, and that was advice from Other Half, basically because if you put it in the Whirlpool, it's just a bunch of crap that is still going to be in the Whirlpool later. Where if you put it in the mash, you get all of the extraction that you need, but it stays the solids stay with the mash too. So it's just kind of putting those things together, and like I said, we didn't really have any expectation other than it's going to be interesting,
right?
And it's going to be a flavor bomb. The Phantasm itself is derived from Sauvignon Blanc grapes, so that's a flavor profile we expected. Kind of the passion fruit, kind of that dank New Zealand grape note.
And this is dried skins from pressed grapes, right?
Basically, just comes in a powder form.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's cool. And I just poured us some beer too, so we're drinking it right now, and it's got a really unique aroma. I get a lot of lemon on it, especially as it warms up, which is not something I expected, but you get that kind of tropical fruit note, the passion fruit.
There's definitely some tropical candy notes,
exactly.
like even a grape candy note, and I can definitely see those kind of tropical passion fruit, mango, kind of thicker, heftier
like
fruit notes. Yeah. But let's talk about malt. I mean, when we talk about thiols, it's easy to think about Phantasm and it's easy to think about hops, but really there's a huge thiol potential in malt itself. And in fact, it's kind of fascinating. There are brewers that are now making no hop or low hopped beers and working on just unlocking those thiols out of malt. Thinking about what kind of flavor stability that might create could be kind of interesting to see where it's good. But for you all, where did you land on that? How'd you build a malt bill for this?
Again, we kind of just took the advice of the experts. So talking with Laura and Lance at Omega, they've done a bunch of these beers, and should we go heavy with adjuncts? Should we do Pilsner malt versus two-row, et cetera? And they said they've had a lot of luck just using Pilsner malt. Probably has something to do with maybe the longer kilning degrades some of those precursors in two-row or even any higher kiln malt. So kind of separately, we've also been playing around with the Heraclea malt from Environment.
Sure.
So we ended up using some of that, which is really interesting. It's Italian grown barley that's then brought up to Germany to be malted, and it's got little more bold characteristics for a Pilsner malt, which I really liked, and we figured that'd be a good kind of backbone for a beer that's going to be, pretty heavy on the kind of the tropical fruit aromas, but to give it a little bit more kind of body and base, but still provide some of those bound thiol precursors that the thiolized yeast could really free. So we did that, and we still added a little bit of oats.
Versus going to something like a Maris Otter or Golden Promise with some of that kind of English heft to it.
Yeah, that's kind of the first place I went. We use a lot of Golden Promise here. Furious has a big chunk of Golden Promise as its malt bill. So we kind of started there, but then ended up transitioning over to Pilsner just based on some of those recommendations. It would be interesting to do kind of side by side and just change the base malt just to see what happens. But I'm really happy with how the Heraclea worked here. We did add some oats just to make sure we have a good little bit of residual body, and want it to be a little bit hazy.
You remember roughly what kind of percentage of oats you put into something like this?
I think we did. I think it was like 10% oats, and we had a little bit of wheat as well. But honestly, it was still pretty primarily just this base malt.
Yeah. And yet you've still got a nice, hazy beer out of it.
Yeah, I mean it's a bright haze. It's not super cloudy,
Right.
but that's great. It's a really nice beer.
Yeah, yeah. So you go there. You mentioned you used Motueka and Calypso. Is that what you were going to say?
Yep, and then we did. That's also interesting too, because coming from the IPA world, you're always taught more is better, right? Like, which is obviously not always the case, and especially not here.
Especially with the science that Shellhaver and others have done, and Jason Perkins and some of these folks, looking at how
there's definitely a saturation
putting
limit.
more in can actually drop those things out that you work so hard to get in there.
And that's definitely been the case with the thiolized yeast. They recommend under 2 pounds a barrel for dry hops. So I think we did it's like 1.5 pounds per barrel for the dry hop with a little bit decent. I don't remember exactly what it was, but a pretty decent Calypso and Motueka in the whirlpool.
Do you remember the rough bitterness, or at least calculated bitterness goal for this?
It was really low. We actually didn't use any hot side hops. We did some mash hopping, I guess. So that's not 100% true, but no kettle hops in here. So we were looking for low to moderate bitterness. So we're going to get a little bit from the whirlpool, but again, we want it to be more of a fruit bomb and just have a really low bitter aspect to the beer.
But fruit still has a little bit of bitterness in it.
Absolutely, and you're going to get some of that too. I think from the grape skins are going to add a little bit of astringency too, with some tannic pickup. So we kind of figured we get bitterness from other aspects to it of the beer.
Do you have a general kind of place where you like those hazier beers to still land? In IBU.
Yeah, I mean most of our hazies, we don't do any hot side hops, or if we do, it's whirlpool. Yeah. We're doing a lot of
so the calculations get weird since it's all coming in.
Most of the time, we're adding hops right at the beginning of fermentation, and then again later during fermentation for those beers. So it's usually little to no actual IBUs, but we all know you're going to pick up some bitterness just in general, and that's been very successful for us.
Do you have a way of even mentally considering what that might be? I mean, again, there's the software can't really give you numbers for that.
It's and
it's just by feel.
And also personally, IBU is so I want to say subjective. Darkness IBUs compared to a Pilsner IBUs are crazy, but the Pilsner is going to taste more bitter than darkness. Just your base beer really plays such a part in what that perceived bitterness is. So I'm always more my sales guys will ask me what the IBU is. I'm just low, moderate, high. That's it.
Sure.
It's one of those measurements that I don't take a lot of stock in personally, and we don't really measure here.
For sure. You're thinking about perception, and finishing gravity.
It's all about sensory at that point.
Works in conjunction with that, which also works with thickness and malt body, and all those are various pieces of the equation that affect that perception of it that might be different from the actual numbers.
Yeah, I think the analogy my friend Gary Nicholas used was it's like going down a hill, and if you're on a bike or in a car, that hill could be very different in terms of your perception of it, right? You could be going 30 miles an hour on a bike, and you could be scared shitless. You can go down in a car, and it's no big deal, and that's kind of how IBUs are. It depends on the vehicle that you're in, what that actually means to kind of the flavor expression and the perceived bitterness you're going to have when you drink that beer.
Sure. Where do you shoot for finishing gravity on these?
For this beer, we're shooting a little bit higher. I think it finished around close to 4 Plato, which is right around where we expected it to, and not having used this yeast before. And it's even Lance and Laura, it's a relatively new version of the yeast, so we kind of had an idea of where it would end up, and it ended up pretty close to that. But I wanted a little bit of residual body and sweetness from the beer. I don't want to dry it out too much. Again, worry a little bit about how the Phantasm and the hops would really play for that kind of perceived bitterness and potential astringency. But really nice. It's got a really soft mouthfeel. It's got a great finishing kind of note on your palate. You really are just kind of left with it feels like you just ate a kiwi or guava. It's awesome.
Sure. And had you worked with these hops before as you were trying to kind of visualize how this flavor would, especially when you're thinking about how that Phantasm element might work with these hop flavors? how did the team consider some of these things?
Yeah, we've definitely been familiar with the hops. We don't use Calypso much, but I've used it in the past a little bit. And with Tweako, we've used here and there. Again, not a lot. We don't get a lot of that hop in, but we kind of understood what the flavor profile was or is for those hops, but it was still an experiment. That's kind of the fun part about collabs. You're willing to take some more risks in terms of what you're going to do, and with the it's going to be good. You just maybe not know exactly what it's going to be. It's not an approach I would take for, say, a new core launch for Surly, obviously. We're going to make sure we know exactly what it's going to be. But that's the fun part about collabs. The literal name of this beer is Thiol and Air. It's a pun because there's definitely some trial and error going on here with the beer. Just seeing how all these things will work together is the fun part about it. And again, that's the beauty of collabs. You can take some risks, and it's about, honestly, more about having fun and hanging out with our friends and making something fun and just seeing what happens.
Sure. What do you do for water on these hazy or juicy or IPAs?
We don't do anything crazy. We don't have any real water treatment here, so we just adjust salts, by adding stuff to our water kettle, mash, lauter, etc. Work kettle. So I don't remember exactly the sulfite chloride ratio we used on this beer, but we adjust those things just based on a style, basically, on what we're brewing. We brewed this at our Brooklyn Center plant. So our water source there comes from, it's groundwater, but it comes through the municipal plant. But we don't do any true treatment. We don't have an RO system yet. We're actually looking at those down at the show, which would be awesome to have. So but we're lucky. Minnesota has great water. So it's hard, but it's relatively easy to manipulate in the brew house without having to have a really hardcore treatment plant.
Sure. So hop usage, you mentioned there's nothing, a little bit of mash hopping. In terms of overall percentage of hops, how much generally goes into that mash hopping approach, and why mash hopping in that sense?
That's another, we've done mash hopping a ton in the past, but that was another piece of advice from Omega and from Sam and other half that you could just achieve a little bit more and get some more potential precursors and free thiols in solution and with that process.
And they don't degrade through the boiling process, then they don't volatilize off.
Yeah, I'm sure some of the aromatics do, but there's definitely some compounds that are staying in solution, and by putting them in the mash too, you're avoiding putting things into the whirlpool, which is just going to cut into your yield at the back end, which is great. And for mash, I think we did like 11 pounds for 30 barrel batch, and then whirlpools, I think we did about maybe like another 1.5 to 2 pounds per barrel in the whirlpool. But the Calypso we used was a salvo, so it's actually an extract. So that also helps with keeping some vegetative material out of the whirlpool. Sure.
That's certainly a concern with everybody making very heavily hop forward beers, that vegetal character can, and then the other benefit of a product like Salvo or any of these flowable hop products is that they're gonna, you have a centrifuge, that's not a problem. They're not going to pull out as much. You're going to get more yield out of it. But they're also pulling that vegetative matter out of it that doesn't give you some of those burny polyphenol piece of it.
Absolutely. And it's a big benefit using the thiolized yeast too, because we're using way less hops. Like, it's kind of funny because in my head I was still thinking we're going to have a really crappy yield because this is a huge IPA, and like we had a wonderful yield on this beer because our hop load's actually way lower than most of our kind of big IPAs that we're making. But you're getting such a great flavor expression and unique flavor expression from just using that thiolized yeast. So it's another benefit for using some of these newer yeasts. You can use less hops, still get really huge tropical fruit notes out of the beer without having to use that huge charge of hops in either the hot side or in dry hop.
Sure. Now, when you whirlpool, you're pulling out at straight off the boil, or do you cool that down at all as you do it?
For this, we just went straight into the whirlpool. We see a little bit of temp drop, but we're not running through a heat exchanger at all. We played around with that a little bit, but we normally don't do that. We just don't have an easy way to do that with our system currently. And honestly, I have a little concern too, because I don't want to overshoot it and then have any potential contamination issues downstream. So that always makes me a little nervous. More from the just stability side of things. but we've had great success. Usually just going straight in the whirlpool.
To get some isomerization that way,
and we kind of plan for that. So I think
right.
as long as you plan for it and kind of expect a little bit there, and just use a little bit less bittering, we have a real nice gentle whirlpool. So I'm not worrying about volatilizing too much.
Yeah.
So again, as long as you plan for it, we don't see a huge pickup in IBU there.
Sure. Well, let's kick and talk about that, fermentation process then, especially as you're using this new yeast that you're not used to, and, you mentioned you're dry hopping in multiple stages there, and exploring how to use this yeast at the same time. So Phantasm went in on the hot side, up front, and then, now you're adding hops into fermentation. Talk to me about that process and, certainly think about timing, but also as you all were considering it as things are going, you have to be kind of figuring out what is going on as it is developing and seeing how those things might be moving, as fermentation commenced.
Definitely. So for this beer, we just did one dry hop towards the end of fermentation. For some of our other kind of more hazy IPAs, we'll do at least 2 hop additions, and we found it really successful to add the hops basically at the same time we're pitching yeast. So so they're in there at the beginning of fermentation.
So that's, from a production standpoint, that's crazy because now, if you're not planning on reusing this yeast, and it's not as big of a deal, but
you got to have a different. You can't crop yeast, obviously,
right.
But that's what we do for like drips and drops is our core hazy, and that's the process for that. Like we 0 hot side hops, and then we're adding hops basically when we're pumping the beer into the fermenter. We're adding the hops as we're pitching yeast.
What's the difference between doing it then and waiting until you've already kind of mostly fermented the beer and can pull some yeast off first?
And we've done it both ways, and we've done a lot of side by side comparisons. Like I'm really big on let's do like 3 or 4 brews and just change one thing at a time and really study them. And I'm very, very lucky because I've got a great lab, a great sensory team that can actually do that and give me that data. And I think we did 13 different brews before we launched our original hazy one on Mosh Pit like years and years and years ago. And we're also doing a stability testing at the same time. So is the haze going to hold up? Because in Minnesota, unfortunately, we really can't sell beer direct to consumer. We have to go through our distribution chain, and beer's got to have at least a 90-day shelf life for us to be viable. Because the last thing I want to do is someone to pick up a beer and have it taste or look like crap. So we actually put a lot of thought in the front end of that beer, and it took us probably 6 months to really develop it. But we found we just got better flavor expression, cleaner beer flavor, and just general preference from doing that process. So we would add. We did like basically day 0, or we could add the first one, day 1, 2, 3 in fermentation, and then, obviously another one at terminal. And across the board, everyone just preferred that first one. So whatever is happening in there, maybe a good question for Laura from Megan next week. Whatever is happening during, whether it's biotransformation, how it's reacting during fermentation, you're going to get some volatilization during fermentation, which is what I was worried about too. Like we're going to lose a lot of aromatics if we're adding it that early. But whatever's happening, it's awesome and it works. So at least for us, and then adding that second dry hop load basically right towards the end of fermentation, close to terminal, has just been really successful for us. So that's kind of how we do our normal core hazy brands. But for this one, knowing that we didn't need to use a lot of hops, we just did that one small dry hop. I think again like 1.5 pounds per barrel, or somewhere between 1.5 and 2 pounds per barrel at terminal. Was all this beer had at the thiol and air with the other half, and again, it tastes like there's probably 6 pounds per barrel.
It tastes like a much heftier hop bill.
So it's wonderful to use that low amount of hops. And apologies to my hop suppliers, you're not going to like that. And get the same kind of flavor profile with just using a different yeast is pretty amazing. Yeah, it kind of blew my mind, to be honest. It's one of those things like they say that, but I think I should use more. right. But you really did. You don't have to. So it's cool. Yeah.
As you're thinking about the way that the Phantasm itself may have impacted the progress of this beer and how those flavors developed. How do you think about that versus if it were just hops alone?
I mean, it's really hard to say since it's just kind of a one-off thing. I was actually talking.
This one you didn't do 13 brews of in order to.
I was talking with Joss though and Laura about actually doing that again, and we just purchased a little 7-barrel system from Mueller. It's on the floor at CBC, so a true R&D brewery that we'll be putting in our Brooklyn Center plant. So our 30-barrel system is great, but it's hard to really do a lot of that kind of true R&D innovation because we just don't have an outlet, and I don't want to put that stress on our sales team trying to sell something that they don't even know what it is. So a 7-barrel system will allow us to do a lot of that. So talking with Josh from Phantasm and Laura from Omega about actually setting up some true trials to do very simple beers, and again trialing different yeasts using some Phantasm and any other products that those guys come out with. And kind of in conjunction with that, and also some hops, and figuring out when and where to use them. You know, how does the yeast affect the flavors? You know, even things like oxygenation, like manipulating those kind of things, and really setting something up over the course of a year to just do a bunch of cool things and really see what happens and really study it. Because this beer tastes great, but I don't really know exactly what contributes what. So I'd love to deconstruct those ingredients and flavors and really figure out how to manipulate them. So in the future, we can, you know, build things up much like we would with any other beer. We're familiar with hops, we're familiar with our yeast, we're familiar with our the malt that we're using, and these are all kind of new products for me personally and for our team and for our lab. So there's a lot of excitement around just continuing to kind of wrap our heads around it, and again, ultimately, so we can kind of control our own destiny with some of these new products.
Sure. Any temperature concerns in using this, or behavior of the yeast that you all noticed during that fermentation, and or did you use any techniques in order to either improve extraction or to keep aromatics inside of the beer, not blow those off?
Nothing really out of the ordinary. We mostly just followed our normal practices. This is a big beer. I think it was about 19, 20 Plato starting. So with bigger beers like that, we always do a second day oxygenation, or within 24 hours before it really starts going, just to make sure that yeast is happy. Again, not using this yeast, we just kind of followed the advice of Omega, and I think we fermented it at 68 or 70. And it worked great. It definitely kind of creeped. It didn't have a really quick curve. So it was moving pretty slow. So I was a little concerned for kind of the first half of the week, but it just kept dropping pretty consistently, about a point a day of Plato. So definitely different. Our house yeast is basically just English ale yeast. So we're very familiar with that. And this definitely reacted a little bit differently, but yeast counts, viability looked great throughout the fermentation. So we didn't get too concerned, just kind of watching it go. And we also, maybe it'll finish a little high. Like, I'm not sure. We haven't used a lot of these ingredients before, but that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's attenuated enough. But yeah, it ended up kind of finishing right around that 4 Plato note on mark where we thought it would.
Cool. You have a GC mass spec? Have you?
I wish.
No.
No.
Okay.
We don't.
Just checking on where that lab is. I'm curious. I would love to, take some of these, especially these thiolized pieces, and I'm maybe I can ask Laura about that too. I'm curious about what actual compounds.
We got them some beers, so I haven't actually talked to her about if they're going to be able to run that, and I thought about sending some out just to a third party lab too, just to kind of get some analysis there. I even think the folks at Sierra would probably take it and look at it for us if we asked them to, because they've got obviously a very nice lab. I'm very curious too to see exactly what compounds are in there and what's really providing some of those aromatics.
Well, it's a tasty beer and it's a fun process, and some creative people involved. Let's switch some gears and talk about West Coast IPA and some of this new school of West Coast IPA that you are engaged in, which is your pure Surly R&D. Before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brewhouse to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brewhouses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented, working with world-renowned industry veterans, and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. Also, are you looking for the tools to make your next improvements in process and quality control? The Mettler Toledo InPro 8630i is the ideal sensor for combined color and turbidity measurements in loudering, filtration, and phase shift operations. Robust, compact, and easy to handle, It supports consistency in beer processing. The InTap portable oxygen meter gives you readings wherever you need them. It's flexible in production for verification, while purging, or for troubleshooting. Whenever you need it, it's your perfect helping hand. Contact Mettler Toledo today to find out more. Ben, we started talking earlier about West Coast IPA, and clearly you guys have a long history of making brash, West Coast IPAs with a certain intensity and an unapologetic character to them. A brand like Furious is kind of a it's a core linchpin of the brewery. But you've been working in that space, launching new West Coast, and you just did launch a new West Coast IPA. Clearly, as we all know, West Coast IPA, which has never gone away, it's always been there and always been a significant seller for everybody, is starting to rise back up again. But yes, we're approaching it through this lens of flavor now, conditioned by all these other things that we know about hops and about process and about using yeast to create, at times a slightly different approach to the same kind of, core underpinnings. Talk to me about, then that creative process of envisioning a new clear West Coast IPA, and then how you've thought about, incorporating some of what's now possible in flavor.
I mean, it's awesome. I mean, the history of IPA over the last 10 years is insane, right? Like, there's so many new variations of IPA and just aromatic hops in general. And, previous to that, all of the true academia around hops was so focused on alpha and bittering and, the right explosion of craft brewing and IPAs, and especially kind of the hazy realm and the insane use of aromatic hops as resulted in a ton new varieties that are amazing, but also resulted in a lot of new academia, new actual research, and what Shellhammer's doing in his lab has been pretty amazing, just to kind of let us wrap our heads around the actual science behind it. I'm a big science process guy. I want to know why we're seeing this, and when you learn why, then you can learn how to manipulate things too. And West Coast IPA was awesome back in the day. That's how I got into IPAs, right? It's like, this beer is awesome. It's so crisp, clean, with this huge citrus note and bitterness. I mean, I love bitter, dry things. Negroni is my favorite cocktail of all time.
Sure.
So I really fell in love with that, and
it's like good metal. It's like loud but melodic, and there's a piece to it there, and you can
exactly. So kind of having things come full circle, and bitter, clean beers kind of coming back. Right. And again, they didn't go anywhere, but they were kind of taking a back seat for a while to some of the other flashier, hazy IPA that have been coming out. But to kind of go back to the drawing board with that style of beer, with kind of the knowledge from not just academia, but obviously just the practical use of different new hops, new hop varieties, new hop products, which has also been a huge boom the last decade too, in terms of the cold side and aromatic focused hop additives and extracts, and like the flowable products and stuff too. Bringing that all back and kind of deconstructing and then reconstructing the West Coast IPA, I think just is going to result in a better beer. And the ability to kind of build that back up with the knowledge that we have is a lot of fun. And you're gonna, I think so. Controlled Chaos is our new West Coast beer, and it is kind of old school. I mean, it's just Amarillo, Cascade, Chinook, which are pretty classic old school hops, but the way we use them and where we use them has changed a little bit based on the knowledge that we've gained from, again, research and our own brewing experience. And the beers,
why those hops, and when you say that process of using them has changed, what are some of those parameters that you started thinking about to tweak to get that expression you want from them?
And it's, maybe I'm just being naive, but back then you just add hops and dry hop, just dump them in the top, walk away, right? And
60-minute, 30-minute, 15, 10, it was just standard hot side hop additions, right?
Yep.
And now we're thinking about bitterness in a different way, where we want more round bitterness that integrates a little bit better in the flavor on that. And so, again, how do you think about taking that, having the intensity, but rounding the edge on that so that it feels good and, becomes more subtle and less assaulting, just more strong but gentle.
Yeah. So kind of to to start, why those hops? I just love those hops a lot, and
Sure.
we actually did a ton of different hop blends when we were working on Hazy's back in those 13 brews that we did.
Sure.
And especially like the Amarillo Cascade blend, we had some other hops in there too, but like I really like those two together, and the Chinook I think really kind of gives a little more punch as well. So I guess also we have those hops in inventory.
Sure.
So it's a little bit of making sure we're using hops that we have on hand, and also trying to find a flavor.
Also, hops that
expression
don't you don't have to mortgage the brewery to afford either.
Yep, and I also made a very conscious choice to stay away from the Citra, stay away from Mosaic, which are hops that are used not just in our beers but kind of everywhere. So, and really focusing on, I mean, those are three phenomenal hops that I think don't get as much attention anymore. So it also differentiate the beer from some of the others in the market, whether it's another West Coast or any other beer for that matter. And yeah, they work great together. And in terms of how we use them a little bit differently, like, we really minimize the kind of the 60-30 knockout hop additions and kind of just simplified the process, because we can accomplish the bitterness that we want with a single addition. And then we could add the hops in the whirlpool and dry hop in a way that we've also become very comfortable with knowing exactly what we're going to get out of them, whether that's an increase in bitterness as well as what compounds are going to follow through on the aromatic side. And then also knowing that with our yeast, what is going to happen for anything on the front end of fermentation and how that's going to kind of, the synergy with the actual terminal dry hop allows us to really construct that beer that, in its original form, it was bitter, clean with big tropical like citrus, grapefruit note, and we can accomplish that, but still add another element of I don't know. It's like a hot. I wish we had some of that beer. So now I want one.
Do you want to? We can pause for a second and go get some.
I don't think I have anything here,
okay.
But so being able to accomplish that big kind of hop bouquet on a very nice. I don't want to say delicate because it's got some balls to it, but it's great because I feel like the final beer is clean, drinkable, and stable too. So it's 2-3 months in, it's tasting great, which is another component of brewing too. With that amount of hops in any beer is always on the forefront of my mind at Surly, because we have to have our beers on a shelf for 3 weeks or 3 months, across the country. We're not national, but we're throughout the Midwest. So we always think like a very small brewery, but we need to perform like a very large brewery. And those two things are at odds with each other most of the time. But when it comes to recipe development, I want to basically knock it out of the park, the same as any of the small breweries around that are able to sell direct to customers.
Sure. What are some in terms of for that stability piece? What are some of those kind of key performance indexes that you all keep an eye on in order to make sure, whether that's evaluating ingredients as they come in and making sure that you're putting things into this beer that are going to have the ability to go that kind of distance. And then through that production process in order to make sure that every piece of that technical puzzle as you're making the beer is not going to detract once it's packaged.
Again, we have a wonderful quality department here at Surly, so thanks to those guys. But yeah, we're monitoring obviously everything that's coming in, looking at our malt COAs. Everybody look at your malt COAs. That's a very important part of brewing. So we're looking at our malt COAs, making sure everything's in spec. And if not, this year, especially with kind of the crisis with barley, making sure that's right and making tweaks to brewing process if we need to. Obviously, hop selection itself is critical to that part of the recipe, and trying to get consistent lots year after year to make sure that as you switch from one lot of Citra to another, it's going to taste the same. And then brewing wise, like we look at everything. I mean, hot side, we're taking samples, we're tracking fermentation, we're looking at yeast cell counts daily, looking at pH, obviously keeping an eye on water quality, and then throughout fermentation, we're taking quite a bit of samples. Just to make sure the yeast and fermentation is going well, and then also looking at micro, so our lab's looking for any potential contamination that could come up, and then packaging is really the critical point, right? Like you can have a really, really good beer, but if you can't package it properly, doesn't matter.
Right.
And most of that's related to dissolved oxygen in your
Right.
beer. And there's a lot of emphasis on brewers, but I think the real rock stars of the brewery are the packaging guys, because if they fuck your beer up, you're fucked. Like it doesn't matter how well you brewed it, how many hops you put in there. If you can't get it in a can, and that can can't hold up on the shelf or bottle for that matter,
You're
it doesn't
tripping at
matter.
the finish line. Yeah.
So honestly, our probably the most investment we've put in on the quality on our side is really making sure that our equipment is where it needs to be, and that our operators know how to troubleshoot in real time. So it's not just one guy that knows how to do it. Like anyone running that line knows, what we're looking at. They're checking TPOs constantly throughout the run on cans, and if it's out of spec, they stop and figure it out, and they do figure it out, which is awesome. So we're running usually sub 150 ppm of O2, like on all of our products at both facilities now, and that's kudos to Levi, our packaging manager, and then his team to keep that in spec, because the moment it leaves here, we really don't have any more control of it. Like, our sales team does a great job of keeping sure like date codes are in spec, and getting stuff off floors if it's not. But again, like once it's out there, we don't have a lot of control, and oxygen really is the biggest factor of that beer from a quality perspective in my mind.
Sure.
At the same time, we're looking at cans, 0, 30, 60, 90 days out in sensory panels, also in micro, and just making sure that everything looks good.
That influences even, hop choice, right? I mean, there are certainly hops, and when you think about it from a production standpoint, there are definitely some of those hops that will sustain a little bit better than others over that kind of time frame.
Yeah, and hops and just the amount, the more hops you use, usually the less shelf stable your beer is going to be, just because like all that vegetal material, and just, we have all smelled old hops. Like,
Sure.
It's not great. So really, oxygen is key, I think, in a lot of that. But yeah, definitely hop choice is important in that too.
Yeah. Now, am I guessing here, but are you using a flowable hop product for bittering at the start of the brew?
We, not for everything. Furious does use that for bittering. For Controlled Chaos, for our new West Coast, we're just using Warrior pellets still for that. Okay. And eventually we might switch that over. So we kind of do a mix depending on the brand and what we're looking at. We've got kind of like a set like package just for Furious, because that's our flagship and that's our number one brand by far. So we use that 100% of the time, and other brands it's kind of just dependent on what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And then dry hopping, you do that with pellets, or do you have any other techniques around that kind of thing?
Again, kind of depends on the beer. For Controlled Chaos, we're using pellets, T90s for that beer.
Yeah.
We're doing that out of our large plant here that we're at. So we use a piece of equipment called a dry hop nick. We've got a Rolec brewery, and Rolec and Amco have a dry hop nick. Some brewers are using those for dry hopping and for adding things like coffee. So you basically get a recirculation loop set up on the tank, and there's kind of almost looks like a garbage disposal, like a maceration pump on the machine.
Right.
And you've got a big booster pump to really like boost your pressure, your head coming off the tank. So you basically suck hops into the beer and get really good extraction. You can use less hops, obviously, than just dumping them in the top, which we do at our smaller brewery. It's just not possible here with our 600 barrel tanks.
So that's moving the hops into the main tank then?
Yeah. So you're basically pushing the hops in as you're recirculating it. And then once all the hops are in, you can just kind of stop. You're good to go. So, and it also helps with, you get some yeast in suspension for VDK scrubbing as well, which is kind of a fringe benefit of doing that too. You kind of speed up that process.
Sure.
But the other thing with
those
that,
hops are not sitting self-contained in the vessel, putting beer through it, but leaving those hops in the vessel. They're actually moving through the main tank itself.
The hops do get put into the beer, so we're not just recirculating the beer through the hops.
Sure.
The hops are basically getting injected into the beer.
That makes sense.
And then when you run the centrifuge, it'll take them.
I've been talking about recirculating, on everything from pastry ingredients now to hops. I feel like I've had that conversation a whole bunch of times over over the last 5 or 6 weeks. But it's interesting that there are these shades of difference and different means by which these things, and some are high concentration infusions and extractions within the tank itself. Some are circulating through, but leaving ingredients in the tank, through using screens and filters to make sure that, flavors going through, but ingredients are staying in put. And that's interesting that you are moving those back into the main tank, which certainly creates a different cleaning process for you. But
absolutely. And it works really well. I had some concerns when we first started using it, if we're going to get more like kind of grassy vegetal notes just from busting all the pellets up and putting them in line. But if anything, I feel like it's a cleaner hop profile, and you can leave the beer on the hops less time as long as your VDK diacetyl is in control. That is one thing we've noticed though, with using this system. We see more hop creep than we would with our process at the other brewery, and I don't know if it's because of that process or not, but it's definitely been an issue with some brands, and again, it seems to be varietal based in terms of how much hop creep you're seeing. But that's been a challenge, but thankfully we're aware of it. We just can see some further attenuation than we maybe normally want to see in some of our brands, but and it's until you really start using some of the hop blends, it's hard to kind of predict some of that and what to expect. But
how have you adjusted for that? I mean, are you looking at things like different, altering the mash regimen in order to kind of adjust for, what hop creep might do at the end, to your finishing gravity?
Yeah, I mean, Control Chaos is a perfect example. It's the first time we brewed it, we had to let it sit, I think almost a full additional week, because we saw a pretty big hop creep, it's like a 1.5 Plato drop after dry hop, after it was terminal.
Yeah.
And, we've adjusted kind of the mash regimen up front to try to just dry it out ahead of time, because it's still kind of finished where we wanted it to, because originally we thought it was going to be a little high at finishing gravity, and then we dry hopped it and it dropped down. So it's frustrating, to be sure. So we've adjusted the kind of the mash regiment a little bit to try to get it to dry out just in fermentation, so you don't have like the dextrins available to continue to ferment.
Right.
And that's helped definitely a lot. Exogenous enzymes you can use ahead of time. But it's hard to really know, because using Amarillo, Cascade, Chinook, I've never seen hop creep with those hops before. So I was actually stunned. Like,
and now you found it. You figured out how to get some.
Yeah. Part of me is curious. I saw a paper on this, and it's something I actually meant to ask Tom Schellheimer when he was here earlier this week about kilning temperatures, because I think there could be a strong correlation with lower kilning temperatures, which folks in the craft brewing industry have been asking for years, if that's actually preserving some of the enzymatic activity in hops, leading to more hop creep. Which is it's funny, because it's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We're getting more aromatics, but we're seeing further attenuation that we may want to.
Getting some drier beers out of it that may not be as juicy. And
so I don't remember who wrote that paper. I apologize, but that really struck a note. It's like, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we all know at higher temperatures enzymes are going to be denatured. So I'm curious to see if as we continue the trend of pushing our suppliers and farmers to kiln at lower temperatures to preserve some of those aromatic compounds, if we're actually also going to see an increase in hop creep potential kind of across the board in our hop varietals.
It's a funny thing, you change one variable, and now your recipes are going to have to change in order to adjust for those
butterfly
things.
Effect, right? So it's interesting though, because you don't see it in every brand. There's like brands like Furious, we haven't messed with that at all, and it's like clockwork. Like, it finishes exactly where it needs to be, and it's got a pretty big dry hop, and it's got Amarillo, it's got Cascade. So what the hell? So it's thankfully, because that's a beer I wouldn't want to attenuate any further than it is, but it's finishing at closer to 4 Plato as well. So there's still some potential dextrins there that could be degraded by any additional enzymatic activity. So it's curious. So we've kind of got Control Chaos figured out on the fermentation side, but that was kind of a wrench I didn't expect. Like, I expect to see hop creep in some of like the big juicy IPAs we're making with things like Sabro,
right.
or some of the newer hops, but I didn't expect to see it there. So it's interesting, and it kind of keeps us on our toes, I guess. But again, thankful we've got the lab to measure those things, so that you're not crashing beers before they're ready to be crashed with potential diacetyl bombs down the road, or God forbid additional fermentation. So again, thankful we're able to actually see that and be able to pivot. So
what do you think is the biggest differentiating factor, with something like Controlled Chaos? Because clearly there's some overlap in terms of hops that are in the beer. You're using the same yeast. The water is the same. Like what are those key points of differentiation in this new school approach to West Coast IPA versus old school?
I think it's got a little bit more of the kind of the juicy component, like whereas old school West Coast is more like just straight up citrus, grapefruit. I think even with kind of using the same kind of hops we would have used back in the day, like I think just the way we would manipulate it and when we're adding them and at what ratios, that we're just getting a little bit more of a juicy note in our modern day West Coast. I think we're also looking at
just
a little bit less
because of those
bitterness.
whirlpool additions, and
and just kind of understanding like.
Are you dry hopping during fermentation on the newer ones too? Or?
Not on that one,
okay.
But I think it being terminal, and using the equipment that we've got, it gets a little bit more kind of those tropical notes, and I think there's a little bit less bitterness too. Like we didn't go quite as hardcore with brands like we used to, like Overrated, which was a pretty bitter IPA.
Yeah.
I think that people are coming back around to bitter, but not quite to the extent that they used to. So I think just cutting bitterness a little bit also accentuates some more of the actual fruit notes and makes it a little more palatable, a little less pithy than some of the more classic versions of West Coast. So as people kind of transition back from maybe drinking more hazies to get back to more West Coast, it's, I think, very approachable. And for folks that aren't familiar with that style too, I think it's a little bit more approachable than some of the enamel strippers of the past.
You can have maybe a perceived 55 IBU West Coast IPA rather than the 80 plus that you might have had,
exactly
in that other realm. That's really interesting. And is there something to the selection of within that variety? Do you select with a different flavor profile in mind, knowing that this might go into this slightly juicy, more fruity, forward West Coast IPA?
I mean, it's just kind of part of the brand development. I mean, if that's kind of what we talked about initially when just kind of conceiving the beer.
Of Amarillo that are earmarked for different.
We're still selecting everything kind of. For selection for hops themselves, I mean, we're really focused more on year to year consistency because we've got like the analysis of the hops and our sensory, and we kind of just keep that rolling year to year. So when we go back to selection, we can review, what did we pick the last 3 years, and our suppliers are getting better and better and better at giving us.
They know your
a lot
spec
more
now, and
analytics,
so they can look at what they have that's within the kind of spec that you tend to like, and make sure that your selection is more nuanced.
And at the end of the day, like it's hard because there's kind of the philosophy of I always pick the best hop on the table.
Yeah.
Or I always pick the one that most or the best represents the flavor profile that we expect from that hop, and those two things kind of can be at odds sometimes. Like there might be a lot of Citra on the table I think is just amazing and really, really pops, but it's not quite what we use in our day-to-day. So I might actually pass on that. And I think some brewers would say you're crazy for doing that. But
sure.
It's one thing if you're just doing one-off batches, but we've got, our legacy brands like Furious that we need to make sure that flavor profile doesn't change year over year. I wish we had the luxury of winemakers and had vintages. And it's a different way of approaching brewing, but here we're really focused on consistency. And that being said, it's fun to find some of those interesting new hops where we will pick. If we don't really know how we're going to use it yet, you can just go straight for like the best and get a few pallets and then use it throughout the year in kind of one-off brands or maybe in a variety pack or seasonal brand. But there's definitely specific hops that we got to make sure are aligned with kind of what we used in the past.
Sure. Let's back out of this a little bit and look at the bigger picture. What's next on the horizon? You know, the craft beer world has a constant need for new. You all have to balance that with the learning that you are engaging in, that to making these beers so that they will last on a shelf where most of your customers are going to find them. You know, and so there's this push and pull in what you do of being innovative. You mentioned you've got a 7-barrel R&D brew house coming so that you can get into more taproom stuff that won't have to go out there into distribution, but that'll allow you to toy with some new ideas. What are some of those places and spaces that you want to explore? You know, as you move forward here.
That's a great question. It's hard because there's like what I want to do, and there's what our customer wants us to do.
Sure.
It's a conversation that Bill Manley, our VP of Brand Development, have constantly, because we want to stay kind of on the forefront. Obviously, we need to be profitable. We need to make sure that we're making the right decisions. And you know, the world out there is changing.
And when people say profitable, I know it always gets a bad rap, but to me, profitable means people like what you're selling. Like it's a validation that consumers are responding to what you're making, and it's a good thing.
Absolutely, and it means that the people we have employed here are going to stay employed. Like that's that's my number one concern. Is like I don't want to make decisions that's going to jeopardize my employees. Like that ultimately is the last thing I want to do. So
right.
And the market's changing, right? Like we've seen what's happened with seltzer, with kind of RTDs and alternative malt beverages, and that's a world that Surly has not played in. And you know, we've made conscious decisions not to, and it's something that we're always kind of asking ourselves is, do we need to go down that road? And that's a very strong possibility that we'll branch out into products that aren't beer. But if we do that, we'll do it with strong intent. I always say that if we're going to go and make something, we're going to make sure it's the best to market. Might not be the first to market, but we're going to do it as best as possible and make sure that product's going to be awesome, and from a quality and stability standpoint, also be successful. So
it's the old Apple philosophy.
Yeah,
you know, you don't need to be the first MP3 player, but you need to be the best.
Exactly.
And you can own the market when you do that.
So it's hard. I mean, personally, like I love to kind of just kind of keep looking for new ingredients. I mean, this other half beer is a perfect example. It's like working with some of the people that are at the forefront of technology, from the yeast side, from the stuff Joss is doing with Phantasm. It's weird and cool, and it's fun to play around with and really push the envelope of brewing. And I think using that new R&D system on a very small scale, hopefully to have effects that ripple up to our large scale production, whether it's using different yeast strains to achieve flavor profiles using less hops. I mean, that's not just a cool thing to do. It's also potentially something that increases our profitability, increases our stability in the beer too. The less hops you use, typically the beer is a little bit more stable. Also, just like always looking at new equipment, we also just got a cross-flow membrane filtration unit from Pentair that we installed to try to get a little bit more stability in our big brands like Furious. So I'm kind of jumping around from point to point right now because my head's kind of all over the place.
Sure.
We talked a little bit earlier about water treatment. I'd love to see more control on that side of the process, because right now we're doing very little, and I think that's an area that we could really build and expand on to affect the beer from everything from process all the way through to flavor and stability. And deaerated water is something that this brewery also doesn't have, that those two things kind of get combined and increase our throughput and also our kind of capability here on a technological side. So yeah, I mean, my brain's a little bit scattered in terms of what's next, because there's so many cool ideas and so many fun things from the creative side in terms of beers, and also on the process side in terms of equipment and just improving continual quality over time.
You have a methodical but also a creative approach, and it's interesting to see those two things in balance or in some sort of tension with you. That's pretty cool. We normally finish the podcast talking about long-term big picture. That's probably a question for Omar more than it is for you, but from your perspective, where do you see Surly in the next few years?
That's a great question, and it's if you know, let me know. No, we're the pandemic's just been such a clusterfuck, man. It's like we had basically hit pause on everything, and we've just been struggling to survive like everybody else. And the whole new focus has been, let's get to tomorrow. Let's make sure our employees are still here. Whether that's through everything we've done, we've been lucky to get some assistance from the government to keep jobs and keep beer flowing. And now that we're kind of coming out of it, you kind of hit the reset button again and kind of breathe a sigh of relief, right? Like it seems like things are looking up, and I hope that's the case long term. And what's next is, continuing to make great beer, improving quality here at the brewery. I think we're throwing around some ideas of potentially doing some satellite locations. So
sure,
let's say a spot in Michigan where we could, be a local presence in a market that we feel has a lot of potential, that we've got not just chain partners, but also some local partners there that could benefit from that. We've got a cool pizza restaurant here at Surly, so it'd be an easy concept to kind of fire up elsewhere with the little brew pub. I mean, we just bought that little 7-barrel, and if we really like that, there's potential we could buy more of those and kind of put them in place, and then also have kind of a place to train folks here and kind of inoculate them with the Surly culture if we're going to do that. So that's a potential. We haven't pulled the trigger on any of those things, but it's if we have a really good year and things continue to look up, I think branching out and doing some of those would be pretty rad. And be a lot of fun for us on all fronts. We have an awesome hospitality team, so like combining that and a smaller scale somewhere else with the brewing side of the business, I think would be pretty cool. Focusing on our business here in Minnesota. Minnesota is still by far our largest market, so doing everything we can to make sure we support the scene here. We're doing a little bit of work to try to improve the laws to give us a little bit more flexibility here. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but Surly is one of 5 breweries in the United States that can't sell beer to customers direct. So we're trying to get that law changed, and that would be kind of a game changer for us just to have that capability. Pretty much every brewer listening probably is able to sell at least a crowler or a growler to someone. And, we used to do a festival called Darkness Day where we'd sell our darkness bottles to customers. And I don't think folks realize that the way that worked is we actually sold the beer to our distributor. They sold it to Brooklyn Center, and they set up a municipal liquor store basically on site and sold all the beer. So we never really made money on that. And again, it's not about making money necessarily. It's more about just actually being able to sell your own beer
with the ridiculous laws. I think that is one benefit of the pandemic in a weird sideline way is that we've realized that liberalizing laws about the way that we sell alcohol is not going to lead to some hedonistic devolution of social society.
And
we can handle this. If breweries can want to sell beer directly, there's still a world for distributors out there, and they can still provide a service.
It's not a zero-sum thing. It's not like if we can sell crowlers that like the liquor store down the street's not going to sell beer. Right. It's like we're all just going to sell more beer, and it's going to create more jobs, more revenue, and yeah, it's kind of silly. We've got this destination brewery here. We would love to hold Darkness Day at our brewery and be able to sell bottles to our customers and have a good time. And in no way would I think that would negatively affect any of our other partners. And I respect that those folks, they do a lot of work for us selling our beer, but I honestly don't see any downside to that. So hopefully we'll be able to have some of those experiences happen in the future. Things are looking actually pretty bright in the session right now, so we'll see what happens.
That's great. Well, I think that's a good place to bring this to a close. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. BSG and RAR Malting Company are the home of fossil-free malt. Think outside the puree box with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Arrived as craft beer's most trusted point-of-sale system. Put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house, and the Mettler Toledo InPro 8630i is your perfect helping hand. Of course, if you enjoy this podcast every week, we would love your support. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. If you do, you'll be able to watch at certain subscription tiers, like our All Access subscription, you'll be able to watch great classes like one upcoming with Laura Burns of Omega Yeast, which we were talking about earlier on. And of course, once again, if you're planning a brewery, head over to breweryworkshop.com for information on our next workshop in Portland, Oregon this July. Ben, if people want to learn more about Surly, where do they find that, or where do they find you?
Go on surlybrewing.com. You can find us on Instagram as well if you want to see some pictures of our wonderful brewery and our beers.
It truly is a beautiful brewery and beer hall and facility here. I mean, it's just spectacular. And we were here a couple nights ago for an industry party. Food's phenomenal. I mean, the entire experience and service is great.
That's great to hear. And then we put pretty much the same emphasis on quality on the food and hospitality side that we do as the beer. So it's a great experience. I guess the best way to get to know Surly is just to come to Minneapolis and come visit us and say hi.
Well, you know what? I do that every year, and I'll be looking forward to doing it again next year. Ben Smith, head brewer for Surly, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah, cheers, man.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.